Life continues to be hard for the animals. Food shortages and a brutal winter mean that their lives are more miserable than ever. For days at a time, the animals had nothing to eat but chaff and mangles. Starvation seemed to stare them in the face. The animals try to conceal this hardship from the outside world. When Mr. Whymper visits the farm, the storage bins are filled with sand and a thin layer of grain on top. Napoleon is more dictatorial than ever. He rarely appears in public, and on these rare occasions, he's surrounded by fierce guard dogs. When he did emerge, it was in a ceremonial manner, with an escort of 6 dogs who closely surrounded him and growled if anyone came too near. Angered by the unrealistic quotas that Napoleon introduces, the hens protest by laying their eggs in the rafters so that they smash on the floor below. Napoleon reacts brutally. Napoleon acted swiftly and ruthlessly. He ordered the hens' rations to be stopped and decreed that any animal giving so much as a grain of corn to a hen should be punished by death. The dogs saw to it that these orders were carried out. Napoleon continues to use Snowball as a scapegoat for the farm's problems. Whenever anything went wrong, it became usual to attribute it to Snowball. If a window was broken or a drain was blocked up, someone was certain to say that Snowball had come in the night and done it. And when the key of the store shed was lost, the whole farm was convinced that Snowball had thrown it down the well. Snowball is also turned into an evil figure that inspires fear in the animals, who in turn look towards Napoleon for protection. The animals were thoroughly frightened. It seemed to them as though Snowball was some kind of invisible influence pervading the air about them and menacing them with all kinds of dangers. In this chapter, Squealer convinces the animals that Napoleon played a far more heroic role in the Battle of Cowshed. He also convinces the animals that Snowball was in league with Farmer Jones from the beginning, and his wound during the battle was just part of an elaborate ruse to let Farmer Jones win. Napoleon awards himself Animal Hero First Class and Animal Hero Second Class. It's in this chapter that Napoleon holds very public trials of animals accused of aiding Snowball. Interestingly, they're the same pigs that protested when Napoleon abolished the Sunday meetings. The dogs promptly execute them. The animals are left shocked, confused, and frightened. Towards the end of the chapter, Napoleon also bans the song Beasts of England and replaces it with a song called Animal Farm. In Chapter 7, Napoleon strengthens his grip over the farm using a number of techniques that put him in the same league as dictators like Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler. In the USSR, the Great Purge was a series of trials, executions, and murders organised by Joseph Stalin to put an end to his political opponents. Although figures vary, it's estimated that Stalin was responsible for killing 20 million people, and many of these people were killed during the Great Purge. During this time, there were a number of high-profile show trials where well-known people were executed after confessing to crimes that they often didn't commit. These confessions were the result of brutal beatings, torture, sleep deprivation, and the threat of violence against their families. After the trials, despite the promise that they would be spared, many of the defendants' families were also murdered. After the Great Purge, one of the senior figures in the NKVD, the name of the Russian secret police, fell out of favour with Joseph Stalin. Nikolai Yezhov was arrested, brutally tortured, and forced to confess to a number of crimes he didn't commit. Historians believe that he was executed because he knew what happened during the Great Purge. After his death, Yezhov became an unperson. In George Orwell's 1984, an unperson is not only someone who has been executed by a country, but also erased from history. A famous photograph of Joseph Stalin and Nikolai Yezhov was doctored after his death to remove him entirely. Napoleon continues leveraging the fear of Snowball so that animals look to him for protection. In fact, Napoleon and Squealer start to rewrite history and suggest that Snowball was in league with Jones from the very start. Although they remember him leading the charge during the Battle of Cowshed, Squealer eventually convinces the animals that this was simply a ruse, and they accept that they did remember it. Napoleon also rewrites history when he awards himself a number of medals during the battle. This chapter demonstrates how authoritarian leaders react to those who challenge their leadership. The hens' protest is brought to a swift and ruthless conclusion. The execution of the animals who've defied Napoleon is also ruthless and bloody. It's not just about eliminating his political rivals, but ensuring others are too afraid to defy him. After the executions, there was a pile of corpses lying before Napoleon's feet, and the air was heavy with the smell of blood. All of the animals are shaken and miserable. There's a poignant moment as Clover and the other animals look across the farm. She reflects that these scenes of terror and slaughter were not what they had worked for when they'd sought to overthrow the human race. And now we're going to have a little bit more of a casual chat about Chapter 7 of Animal Farm. As always, you'll need a pen or you'll need a highlighter to mark important passages, important quotes, and to make observations about this chapter and the ideas that it explores. In many ways, I think Chapter 7 is a really crucial chapter in the novel, and for me, it is certainly one of the most shocking. The execution of the animals is a complete betrayal of the original idea of animalism, and it's shocking in the way Orwell describes it. This chapter, once again, like Chapter 6, it really starts by highlighting the fact that they were always cold and usually hungry as well. Only Boxer and Clover never lost heart. Squealer made excellent speeches on the joy of service and the dignity of labour, but the other animals found more inspiration in Boxer's strength and his never-failing cry of "I will work harder." Orwell's laying it on pretty thick, and that's going to pay off in a few chapters when Boxer is ultimately betrayed by the pigs. What I find really interesting about this chapter is the way Napoleon is increasingly distant from the other animals. And in these days, Napoleon rarely appeared in public, but spent all of his time in the farmhouse where he was guarded at each door by fierce-looking dogs. When he did emerge, it was in a ceremonial manner, with an escort of 6 dogs who closely surrounded him and growled if anyone came too near. I guess Napoleon taking on the role of, a classic dictator in this story by now. It's not uncommon for dictators in the real world to live in extreme palatial wealth while their subjects live in abject poverty and squalor. And this is something that we've seen happen all too often in the real world. Of course, there are a few really crucial plot points in this chapter, and the first is the hens' protest. They're standing up to the very harsh quotas that Napoleon has imposed, and he reacts very, very swiftly to that. And then you've got this continuing kind of scapegoating and fear around Snowball. He was rumoured to be hiding in one of the neighbouring farms, either Foxwood or Pinchfield. Again, Napoleon using these tales of Snowball to incite fear and, build support for his leadership and the leadership of the pigs. And what this does to the animals is actually quite interesting. Snowball was secretly frequenting the farm by night. The animals were so disturbed that they could hardly sleep in their stalls. And I guess at this stage, they must be very grateful that there's a powerful and very strong leader like Napoleon to protect them. And of course, Napoleon reveals that Snowball was in league with Jones from the very start. I've already mentioned in previous episodes that during the Spanish Civil War, Orwell became obsessed with the idea that the lies and the party propaganda that the ruling party put out there would eventually find its way into history. And here we have Napoleon basically rewriting history to make himself look better. What I love about the character of Boxer is the fact that he's very noble and very good. And when these stories about Snowball start to come out, he says, "I do not believe that Snowball was a traitor at the beginning," he said finally. "What he has done since is different. But I believe that at the Battle of Cowshed, he was a good comrade." And what I find really fascinating about this, and I think this, I read this book for the first time many years ago, and I've really just noticed this line here. After Boxer says these things, Squealer does this. "That is the true spirit, comrade," cried Squealer. But it was noticed that he cast a very ugly look at Boxer with his little twinkling eye. Squealer's up to something there, that bastard. And of course, what I think is one of the most dramatic scenes in the novel, the execution of the animals, occurs in this chapter. And what I find really interesting about this is the way Napoleon asks the animals to assemble in the yard, and he kind of files in, and he's surrounded by those dogs. And here you get a really interesting description of how the animals respond to them. With his 9 huge dogs frisking round him and uttering growls that sent shivers down all the animals' spines, they all cowered silently in their places, seeming to know in advance that some terrible thing was about to happen. So I think, possibly more than any part in the book, this demonstrates the kind of fear that these vicious guard dogs incite in the other animals, and how tremendously motivating fear is, and how it can be used by leaders like Napoleon to keep the animals in line. I actually find the descriptions of this scene really disturbing. So immediately the dogs bounded forward, seized 4 of the pigs by the ears and dragged them forward, squealing in pain and terror to Napoleon's feet. The pigs' ears were bleeding, and the dogs had tasted blood, and for a few moments they appeared to go quite mad. What I also like about this moment is the noble boxer who, steps in to protect these animals, and it's not until Napoleon basically directs him to stand down that he does. What's really interesting about this, and it might seem quite strange to someone reading it for the first time, is the way these pigs confess to certain crimes. This is obviously a reference to the mock trials during the Great Purge, where people would often commit to crimes that they hadn't committed because they were tortured, because they were threatened, because their families were threatened. And that's really what's happening here. You're getting a number of animals confessing to outrageous crimes. And the executions are actually pretty swift and brutal. The dogs promptly tore their throats out. They were slain on the spot. And what I find particularly affecting about this scene is that little bit at the end, a pile of corpses laying before Napoleon's feet, and the air was heavy with the smell of blood. And what I think is really important here is the reaction of the animals, the reaction of those animals that we've come to identify with throughout this narrative. They were shaken and miserable. And this whole scene, where they walk out and they look over Animal Farm from atop this knoll. They'd made their way out to the little knoll where the half-finished windmill stood, and with one accord they all lay down as though huddling together for warmth. Clover, Muriel, Benjamin, the cows, the sheep, and the whole flock of geese and hens, everyone indeed, except the cat, who'd suddenly disappeared just before Napoleon ordered the animals to assemble. For some time, nobody spoke. Only Boxer remained on his feet. He fidgeted to and fro, swashing his long black tail against his sides and occasionally uttering a little whinny of surprise. Finally he said, "I do not understand it. I would not have believed that such a thing could happen on our farm. It must be due to some fault in ourselves. The solution, as I see it, is to work harder. From now onwards, I shall get up a full hour earlier in the mornings." And a little bit further on the next page, you've got this very moving scene where Clover looks upon the farm and sort of reflects on what's just happened. As Clover looked down the hillside, her eyes filled with tears. If she could have spoken her thoughts, it would have been to say that this was not what they had aimed at when they'd set themselves years ago to work for the overthrow of the human race. These scenes of terror and slaughter were not what they had looked forward to on that night when old Major First stirred them to rebellion. And she really struggles to articulate what she's feeling. Whatever happened, she would remain faithful, work hard, carry out the orders that were given to her and accept the leadership of Napoleon. But still, it was not for this that she and the other animals had hoped and toiled. It was not for this that they had built the windmill and faced the pellets of Jones's gun. Such were her thoughts, though she lacked the words to express them. And I think this is very much, the sadness and regret that Orwell, felt in response to what seemed to be a promising socialist revolution in Russia, working people taking control of the country to create a society of free and equal human beings. And as I've said in previous episodes, Orwell was one of the few people in the British left who acknowledged what was happening in the Soviet Union and really saw that this promising revolution had descended into a terrible totalitarian regime. So I think Clover's regret and Clover's thoughts are Orwell's thoughts in relation to that revolution. Very interesting as well that in this chapter, Napoleon basically bans Beasts of England. They claim that the rebellion is over. There is no more need for rebellion. So it's been replaced with another song composed by Minimus called Animal Farm. And the first 2 lines, Animal Farm, never through me shalt thou come to harm. So instead of, celebrating the spirit of rebellion and standing up for fairness and striving for a world of free and equal human beings or animals, what the animals are doing now is singing about the farm and the might of the farm. So I guess that spirit of rebellion has been replaced with nationalism. What a depressing chapter. Let's go do some writing. For this chapter, I'd like you to respond to the following topic. In Chapter 7, there's a contrast between the nobility of Boxer and the treachery of Napoleon, discussed. When you're writing a response, as always, use a teal paragraph. Start with a topic sentence. Explain your stance on the topic. Do you agree that there's a contrast between the nobility of Boxer and the treachery of Napoleon? Then go on to explain examples of Boxer's nobility and Napoleon's treachery. Along the way, make sure you make reference to specific events that occur in this chapter and also use some short quotations in sentences of your own to support that discussion. At the end, close off with a sentence that links back to the topic. I hope you enjoyed that look at Chapter 7. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.